Okay.
Hi, my name is Latha Poonamallee. I'm an associate professor of management at the New School.
And my name is Evan Henritze. I'm a clinical psychology doctoral student at the New School. And we are going to offer a presentation on some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. Do you want to open up the slides?
Yep. Right. Share. All right.
There we go.
So in this project, we are kind of presenting some of our very preliminary findings and theoretical understandings of how to evoke socio-ecological embeddedness in immigrant and diasporic population. And since both of us come from a history of personal mindfulness practice and implementing it in different contexts, we are using, we give you an example of how to use mindfulness in restoring this connection and facilitating a healing journey from rupture to connection with the physical environment. And so today we open with the grounding embedded identity exercise. And I invite you to take a moment and ask yourself, who am I? Where do I come from? Who are my people? What is my place? What is my home? Thank you for joining this. This is obviously very loaded and sometimes challenging and sometimes embarrassing and awkward questions that all of us feel. And we will introduce the concept of socio-ecological embeddedness, and we will examine the impact of the loss of such embeddedness among immigrant and diaspora communities in particular, but also in general, what we call the tragic epistemic rupture of this disconnect for us as people from nature. And we will also learn, or at least we are going to share what we learned about how to evoke the reclamation of the vital connection through a healing journey using some first-person accounts that we have analyzed. And in terms of, yes, Evan.
I was just gonna say something before we slip to this next slide, which is that experience of doing the exercise really highlights exactly that epistemic rupture in our own lived experience. These moments where at various times we might lose sight of these types of connections that we have. Did you want to go back to the slides?
Yes. And a second, I think I lost the slides. Okay.
Yeah. And as such, we are using this concept of embeddedness as a way of actually re-engaging with various dimensions of our experience and our identities that are potentially lost, have been lost. And we use contemplative practice as a methodology to support that reconnecting process. We also draw from the theoretical concept of social embeddedness, a term that was originally attributed to Carl Polanyi, who talked about the presence of social relations and social reciprocity in the context of economic systems of pre-industrial societies. And that idea was extended by Granovetter, who provided a way to think about markets and actors in moving away from a duality between being under-socialized or over-socialized. In other words, that an under-socialized representation would be one in which more of a neoclassical conception of a rational actor with sort of perfect information, acting in a system, within a market, versus an over-socialized model, which might think of our relations, our economic activity, the way that we make choices, our behaviors, purely driven by social factors. And so we use this term in embeddedness to really emphasize that individuals are not atomized entities, that we exist within networked relationships, which allow us to contextualize and recognize our relationships to institutions in a more complex way, and inclusive of our identity constructs, that we're not simply economic actors, but we are in fact embedded within these larger social systems. If you could go to the next slide.
Right.
So the concept of ecological embeddedness was introduced by Whiteman and Cooper. They extended upon this concept of social embeddedness and started to think about how that we are not only social creatures, that we're not only socially embedded, but we're also contextualized within nature. So in other words, individuals and organizations enact distinct practices based on the ways in which they are embedded within the lands in which they occupy and engage with and work and live in. And their particular research was focused on Cree tallymen, and recognized that these indigenous folk were managers of the land in a very particular way, that their beliefs and knowledges and practices were determined and intertwined with the land in which they lived. And so their stewardship had a sense of being in a place, and their notions of sustainability was built within that knowledge. This is sort of the precursor in relationship to research on place attachment, place-based identity, and starts to again unbind this duality that that humans live purely in culture versus humans living engaged in ecology, and that there's a lot trying to break down the human non-human divide. So again, this concept helps us understand the connection to land, history, geography, and emotional and ancestral connections.
And so in our study, we're bringing these two things together, the social embeddedness and the ecological embeddedness, to look at what does the socio-ecological embeddedness look like and feel like. And it was first the idea of the socio-ecological systems was put forth by Burks and Folks in 1998. And so they looked at a lot of these anthropological studies were looking at how societies and ecological evolution co-evolve, and that we are part of the nature and we are not separate from the physical environment. And then there's another study which Meman and Kirk, their series of studies have looked at New Zealand, and especially Maori practice informed studies of the New Zealand fisheries industry, where they talked about the social context of embeddedness and relationship to nature. They are like really crucial in how we manage and steward natural resources, and looking at sustainability decisions from a complex systems perspective, and really looking at how do we connect with the different borders and different frames, because it's also one of the things with sustainability discourse that we know is that it is fraught with a lot of political and power dynamics in terms of whose perspective, whose vantage point, and where are the boundaries, and which a lot of them are like arbitrary, but a lot of them have history with the boundaries, history and the geography. And this particular framework that we have developed and utilized in this study addresses the gap between the social and ecological embeddedness understanding. And it also takes this forward a little bit more, because most ecological embeddedness literature and understandings are focused on personal history and ancestral history and ties to a location. And most sustainability and stewardship understandings in the field really come from indigenous systems that are predicated upon local ties, local knowledge, local ties, and local history, local geography, and genetic connections and kinship networks. These are the fundamental, underpinnings of these kind of frameworks. And at the same time, where we are pushing forward to look at is that there is a large population that is actually not tied to a community or a location because they are immigrants by force or by choice. And so they're displaced peoples. And so they are disconnected from the history and geography, and sometimes even the genetic ties that bind people to a particular location. And so that raises the question of expanding the notion of the place attachment and the place-space identity systems. And so here, primarily, the values here is that we are all part of one whole. That is the human and non-human beings, and humans live in both culture and nature. And looking at also the embodied relationship with nature and society, like does the body have to learn how to live in a new place? Like if you move from the tropics to the cold East Coast, how do you actually deal with that? And does your body have to learn to adjust? And it is very deeply interconnected with identities. Like how do we actually define ourselves? Do I define myself as an immigrant? For how long do I define myself as an immigrant? And do I define myself as intersectionally, the gender and class and ethnicity and language and cultural background and religion and location? And they all kind of coexist, but the location becomes really crucial in the context of natural environment, stewardship of the environment. And if the location is so key to a particular understanding of how we operate in the world and how we make decisions, how we share resources, how we treat the environment, and what kind of responsibility do we take for the environment, and all those are very deeply tied to identities. So that's kind of what we're trying to explore in the study, looking at the socio-ecological embeddedness and identities.
So we thought now that it might be nice to share some personal stories from students who have worked with Latha in the past, who are also immigrants, and their relationship to home. So we're going to share about a 7-minute video of 2 of those students. I think I can share. Let's see. Yes. Okay, Latha, you can stop your screen share if you're still sharing screen.
All right.
And then we'll come back to the slides. Okay, I'm going to just make sure that the audio went through there. One sec. Okay, that should do it. They're with us.
So in terms of what this home meant to me before moving here was, I think it meant that the place that I was born into. Before, my understanding of home was just the place that you were born into, that you were embraced into. And I grew up in a country that has very little diversity. So as Latha said, everywhere I see people like me, and there was no question of, like facing difficulties or like challenging my own identity. And I always had comfort in those kind of matters. But after coming here, I started realizing, like, okay, so home doesn't necessarily directly translate to just the place you were born into. So right now, what comes to my mind when it comes to thinking of home is the steppe, the countryside of my country, weirdly, because I didn't grow up in the countryside and I grew up in the periphery of the capital city. But I think it really connects to the ancestral knowledge and memory that carries through generations, and not necessarily just the direct experience you have over your lifetime. And I think it's just the cultural heritage that you carry, whether consciously or unconsciously. But at the same time, as Latha was saying, home means a sense of belonging, right? But as I was growing up in my society, I almost kind of felt always kind of out of place. although I kind of suppressed that part of me throughout the years and really didn't accept the idea that I just wanted to fit in. What I am challengingly like questioning my own idea of home is really just rooted in, are you accepted in your home? Like, what defines your home, and are you accepted in that place? Do you feel like your value system align at your home? And I think that really connects to what home means to me right now. And I think especially place-based identity is really strong. And I think I will carry my homeland wherever I go, especially because my research interest is very rooted in indigeneity. And I come from a long line of indigenous people of the Mongolian culture and the millennia of indigenous traditional living. So I'm still trying to figure out like how to define home and how to also not kind of carry shame and stigma when it comes to, oh, I found home here, but it doesn't also diminish the fact that I do miss and I still, you know, connect to my homeland back in Mongolia. So that is, right now I'm at that point where I'm still kind of navigating through these questions, but that is how I would say about what homes mean to me and how I'm thinking of it right now.
Charisse, same question for you. How has home shifted over time for you, and what type of connection do you maintain to your various homelands?
Right. So this is a question that really just spans throughout my lifetime. Thinking through this and reflecting on it. What I've come to realize is that I always find home wherever I find the Filipino diaspora. There's always a community of Filipinos in the cities that I end up in, and that creates a sense of home. In terms of home as my birthplace, as my city. Even though Tagalog isn't my first language, it's vernacular, and when Tagalog and English are mixed together in Taglish, just creates a sense of home through words for me. But it also means, and when I think of home, is actually Australia. When I picture the landscape and the surroundings, and what I've come to realize is that it's a place where I've spent so much of my life actually on foot in the streets and the getting around in Australia. I didn't drive when I was there. I used to take public transit everywhere, and just became really familiar with Sydney as a city because my feet were always on the ground there. Whereas I didn't always find that in each of the cities I've lived in. When you live in parts of the States where you constantly drive everywhere, you just feel a sense of disconnectedness from where you actually live. You just think of getting from point A to B, and you don't really get the feel and the flavor of a place. It doesn't become instantly familiar to you unless you actually have your feet on the ground. And I think that's also why New York has become much more of a home to me, and what I would secondarily think of when I think of home, because of how it's a place that relies on you being able to navigate on foot. So where my feet are on the ground would be a second answer to that. And yeah, so it's rooted in a sense of community and belonging, but also where you are planted.
And so Charisse, maybe if you want to continue to speak a little bit more about what does it look like to learn to dwell in another place?
This is a really important question to reflect on, to dwell on, how we keep connected to a place where, you know, in our globalized world, we don't actually live in, and we can be in two places at once, really. When we just sign on to any social media app, you're there in Australia in somebody else's living room, but then you're here in your own bedroom. And technology can be wonderful at facilitating a sense of connection and being together in what can sometimes feel like real time, but it also feels outside of time, and can kind of contribute to making you feel more displaced when you don't feel present where you are. So there's that aspect of displacement and navigating time zones and trying to stay present where you are, while also trying to stay connected to where you come from. The second part of your question, which has to do with indigeneity and actually being from a place. I think for me, what I've come to learn living in New York is that the more I actually find out about New York, the more I go upstate and not just like in the center of the city and spend time in nature, as cliche as that sounds, but really just like taking in each season, examining trees and plants and animals around me, and getting a sense of what the land was before it became this like Mecca. I think that helps me to understand what the original caretakers see, or like how New York was before, and how it still requires a sense of care and cultivation today. And then coming back to places in the city, in Brooklyn, where people are still trying to do that, like joining in those movements.
Okay.
All right. Share the screen. Okay. Is it visible?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the original rupture, and I'm going to let Evan talk more about the trauma part, since he's a psychologist. And so, I want to frame this in the context of a brief socio-ecological history of India. Until 1857, the Indian, even though there was colonization, it was colonized by the British East India Company and not the British government. In the first 1857, the first war of Indian independence led to the country being assumed by Queen Victoria under the crown. That made entire land belong to the Queen and not to the country that actually it was in. And that meant people that lived off the land, the hunters and gatherers and the artisans that collected material for their crafts, and it did not mean that there was no market. They did actually bring it and sell it in the market, because India has had a pretty robust kind of economic system of barter and sale and trade for centuries before that. But what this meant was that the people that actually belonged to the land had to pay money to collect anything. Like if they're collecting saffron, they're collecting honey to sell in the market, or they're collecting bamboo to. So this led to a real disruption of actual connection with the land and literal ownership. And so a lot of the rupture in terms of connection with the land is historic, in terms of settled agriculture versus the hunter-gatherer nomadic groups that we used to be in millennia back, but also in more recent times, over the past few centuries, where the industrialization has led to a lot of denuding of the place, which is like there are no trees, there are no natural resources. That also means like we have to look for new places to go, and you see that even today, the exploration to Mars, where there's imagining of Mars being our new home, because we are going to be exhausting our resources on planet Earth, is a continuing understanding of how we as human beings can have dominion over nature, and we as human beings are separate from nature, that we can actually disconnect and oppress and exploit and extract resources as if there is no end to it, and as if it is kind of endless source of natural resources that we can continue to use with no responsibility. And so kind of picking the thread back with the ecological history of India is that, and this community that is being displaced by various interventions and disrupted are actually called the ecological refugees, because they become refugees. And so, because they don't have access to their own land, they have to pay taxes to get things from their own land, or they have to pay to acquire, collect and live their normal, or what is normal to them for historic for centuries and millennia, which is living off the land, is they have to pay for it, or it gets disrupted, or it's kind of like a hunting ban, for example, in certain countries in Africa, really disproportionately affects the native communities, indigenous communities that have lived a certain way for a very long time. And so that kind of a disruption creates what is called the, as I said, ecological refugees. And people who live off of the land are called the ecosystem people. But I think the globe today is predominantly what they call the ecological omnivores. That means we are global people. We can take everything from everywhere and have multiple homes in different places. And it's not just a judgmental kind of a statement. It is just a description of who controls the resources and who has access to resources and who are the refugees, who are the displaced people. And this is like the original, what I call the original rupture, which is the disconnect between us as human beings and nature where we live, which hosts us, which nourishes us, which feeds us. And so that's the original rupture, which we believe in our approach to this work is that it has trauma inbuilt in it. And Evan will talk about a bit more about the trauma.
Yeah, building on what Latha is saying, I think this original trauma, original rupture, you could understand to be in relationship to these shifts in epistemologies that emerge in the context of industrialization, and also that the original trauma is potentially rooted in these early colonizing acts and behaviors and systems of thought that effectively separate human awareness to one's responsibility to the earth. And so one way that we've been thinking about this, we call it a ecological trauma, a climate trauma, is this relationship of loss of responsibility or confusion of responsibility. And Latha, I don't know if you want to be still sharing that, but yeah. And that you can think about this climate trauma or ecological trauma is not existing within kind of traditional ways of thinking about trauma, in the sense that there's no easy distinction between perpetrator and victim, or even between past, present, and future, that there's an ongoing process in which one is aware of historical, present, and future colonizing and colonized acts. Of course, with the recognition that there is differences too. And we think about this in the context of trauma by drawing from the framework of moral injury, which some consider as not as a sign of disorder, but actually potentially understood to be a sign of mental health. That is, to experience moral injury is to actually be able to wrestle with a certain responsibility. In many of the texts that we have started to code, we see evidence of these ways in which the reclamation of indigeneity involves a re-wrestling, a re-engaging with responsibility in the face of this trauma, and to recognize both the disempowerment and structural disempowerment, but also the potential for collective care and well-being. And so we think about moral injury in relationship to trauma as necessary in a sense for these processes of remorse, for forgiveness, and understanding individual and collective culpability, and that we're thinking of ecological social embeddedness as actually part of this healing journey in relationship to the recovery of moral injury and trauma, climate trauma.
And so we started looking at what does this healing journey look like, and how do we reclaim the sacred, or what we call evoke the indigeneity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the study and the method. So we adopted a qualitative method since we wanted to kind of get at the narratives and the phenomenological experience and the journey of both trauma and the reconnection. And we've particularly used the grounded theory and the methods of constant comparison of coding and going back to theory and continuously refining our categories and frameworks. And for this particular study that we're presenting, it's a preliminary kind of a framework and analysis. We've used the secondary data of using narrative approach. We've coded using the grounded theory principles, personal accounts of 15 women who have written about how they have reclaimed their own indigeneity and ecological renewal. And so we are presenting a very, very preliminary theoretical categories and model. And we have not yet arrived at the theoretical saturation, so we're continuing to code and continuing to also collect new data. So the analytical pathways for this is that both of us coded independently as a first open codes, and we arrived at 495 codes. And then we, through this process, sat together and discussed our codes and arrived at iterated reliability and resolved and came up with 379 first level codes, which then we organized into second order categories of 38 categories. And we, at this point, also went back to some of the theoretical frameworks on socio-ecological embeddedness, as well as the trauma and the healing, and went back to the data. And so we now came up with 3 theoretical categories. One is key dimensions of just this phenomenon, and then some framework ideas about socio-ecological embeddedness. And then the third is the reclaiming the sacred, or the evoking the indigenous, because we are really interested in, like, is re-indigenizing possible regardless of where we are, like, especially for displaced people, is connecting to their adopted land, or connecting to the, and of course, like looking at the local global connection. Some of us belong in different places, and how do we then connect to the different places, and also the larger planetary concerns. So some of the categories that we have identified in key dimensions is, one is definitely from using the coding of the narratives and the stories of these women, is that one of the primary dimension is like affect and emotions. And this is a very emotional journey. People talk about the emotions with regard to the hurt, to the disconnect, the rupture and the isolation and the loneliness and the isolating and disconnecting nature of capitalism, and also the reconnecting and finding their roots and ancestral connection. And it is identity is another key dimension that people talk about, and that is also reinforced by our findings from the literature. And the epistemic trauma of separation from nature in different points of time in history, and these accounts, that the second person accounts that we have looked at, are really looking at more recent, of course, because these are women that talk about as colonized subjects, and in a sense like self-liberation and redefining their own identity, and power, politics, and borders. And I think these are very important aspects when we talk about place-based attachment, place attachment, and place-based identities. Borders are like sometimes historical, but a lot of times they're arbitrary. And so these are like the key dimensions that we find from the data. And in terms of socio-ecological embeddedness framework, and a lot of the data reinforces our understandings from theory, and that we laid out before, is that we are nature's a particularly holistic approach. It is a particular holistic ontology to looking at this phenomenon, that we are nature. And that means ecological justice cannot be separated from social justice. They need to be linked together. And then this is a particular assumption that we operate from, and the data is the accounts, the personal narratives also reflect some of this assumption, which is that even though we may not be indigenous to some place, this is very important, especially for immigrants, whether they're even the settlers, is that everybody is indigenous to someplace, that we all have history someplace, we all have ancestry someplace. And I think this reclamation of our own indigeneity from wherever we are is really crucial for developing socio-ecological embeddedness. And socio-ecological embeddedness is a fundamental value is guardianship ethic, that we are guardians of the planet, we are guardians of the place we are guardians of the resources we are entrusted with. And that is a very indigenous framework of looking at intergenerational guardianship, that we are not just responsible for our own lifetime and our children that we want to leave some things for, but also looking at multiple generations and a longer arc of time. And this is again like a particular one that our framing brings, which is that both global and local knowledge are important, because a lot of indigenous knowledge systems are very based on local. But the fact is that for immigrants and the displaced and the diasporic people, both the global and the local understandings become really important, because if you have to become part of where you are in your adopted land or where you have landed, so to say, it becomes important to understand that there are multiple perspectives, and so both the global and the local kind of become personal. This framework really grounds this ethic in shared traditions, that we need to be able to look at both culture and ecology as shared tradition. And it does take a collaborative view, and looking at it's earth-centered. And so these are some of the socio-ecological embeddedness framework principles that we have coded and analyzed and gleaned from the data. And I'm not going to go into detail with this, but this is like the key, which is like, the journey of re-indigenizing, or the journey of moving from disconnect to connection, from rupture to healing, is really, has a very, very strong kind of a themes from the data that people talk about their own personal histories, but also some of the interventions they have done with other, groups of people in re-evoking and connection with their own ancestral roots. And so we're going to share some of the examples and the quotes from the data, and Evan will do that.
Right. So one program that we find particularly compelling was a program that was introduced in 2013. The program is called the Native Youth Guardians of the Waters program. And it provided Native and Indigenous young adults access to Native watercraft traditions. So a really embodied physical activity and process done in group, in community, supporting cultural healing through a variety of explorations, not only with their hands physically being with water, being with these watercrafts, but also supporting personal expression, both in voice, but also in these creative endeavors of actually working with the arts. And like I said, in community, so through listening, group discussions, and exploring connections between cultural healing, ecological health, and also personal and collective identities and the arts. So we felt like it was a great example of all of these interconnecting elements. So I just wanted to highlight this 5 elements of their program. The first is Ocean Calls, where the youth begin to participate and become guardians of the water, where they really sign up for what will be a demanding process of re-indigeneity through this educational experience. In other words, that the ocean is calling them, that something is supporting them on their journey that is beyond them, that is deeper than them on their own, and yet it's quite a personal journey. Ice hurts, right? So this is this recognition of some of grief and pain and difficult work of connecting with native waters and lands that have been displaced from one's identity, from one's history, often realizing at this part of the journey that the young women really reported this connection from their ancestors, from the elements, and from themselves, and really starting to reconcile and deal with these devastating results of colonization and capitalism on their communities, on their lands, on their waters, and that feeling the grief, shame, and anger is essential for the process. And then lakes are ancestors. This is where sort of you're interweaving between the pain and the healing, that the ancestors show up as allies, calling the young women to join them to find the courage and strength to heal and transform. And in this process, the women connect with their own ancestors and have an inspired engagement of courage, resilience, and it actually can take the ancestors as being embodied in the water as a process of supporting them as medicine almost. And then the rivers connect and heal, right? And this is a process where the native teachers engage with the youth to re-remember and reconnect. And by reclaiming Indigenous health Indigenous perspectives, Native media, Native arts and skills. They're not only transforming themselves, but are also transforming their communities, excuse me, and share that knowledge with others going forward. And finally, RAIN is Cycle of Life, where the young women can take this work and this transformation and bring it to others as their own leaders in their communities, and share the work that they've done through various media, through courses, college endeavors, and then even through film festivals and social media. Do we still have the slides shared?
Isn't it? It says I'm sharing screen.
I don't see it on my end.
Oh, really? That's I don't know. I'm going to stop and try again.
Okay.
And see if I can show, because
Okay.
is that good? Yeah.
That works. Yeah. So these are just some quotes from participants in this particular group that represent various stages that I just mentioned. So Monsi, who's Mexican-American, she says, if you look at me, I probably have indigenous blood in me, but I have no way of knowing that. It's been so disconnected, torn apart. So there is shame and frustration. It is internalized, but you do not talk about it. We are trying to reconnect all these pieces that have been torn away from us. And Natalie shares, I felt myself being transported in space and time by several sets of thousands of years to some watery place in the valley of central Mexico. I visualized the importance of this act of remembering myself and remembering myself. Natalie continues and acknowledging that this project is important because it counters all those negative experiences by encouraging the value of being in touch with my indigenous cultural identity and its active practice in the recuperation of forgotten traditions, which are now remembered. And then this is from another one of the authors of our secondary source material, talking about how the quality of grief needs to be understood within the context of the particular indigenous tradition that it's operating under. So in other words, a concept of grief taken from sort of a contemporary diagnostic lens potentially doesn't actually meet the experience of grief that this author talks about. Lenny Mendoza Strobel. So she writes, indigenous paradigms have a much better understanding of the role of grief and suffering as part of the human experience. Grief is balanced by a cosmic vision that doesn't put human species as the be-all and end-all of creation. When we take our place as one of the beautiful beings among millions of other beings, human and non-human, then our grief is released from the individualistic isolation that marks the modern experience. In so doing, grief can be a work of love and compassion, a work of restoring balance and harmony, all of which are done in the context of community.
So very quickly, we're going to run through some of the potential implications for research, teaching, and practice. And so, as we mentioned, one of our kind of framing understanding and curiosity is about how mindfulness and contemplative methodologies can help in this reconnection process. And so there is some, research supporting this this aspiration that mindfulness practice is increasingly considered to foster pro-ecological behaviors, and it helps in transcending egocentrism and engaging also parasympathetic nervous system that opens up possibilities rather than stress arousal. And it also cultivates inner resources and resilience, which we think are very crucial to address the shame and the trauma and to embark in the healing journey. And so I just want to share a class that I have begun to teach using this methodology. And so this class is informed by decolonization approaches and socio-ecological perspectives. So it really centers the students' individual and collective healing and identity examination. for flourishing in the context of a relationship with natural environment, and uses mindfulness and contemplative pedagogy as the pedagogical framework and kind of like a scaffolding framework for students to explore some of these ideas and provide space for healing and addressing their own trauma and grief. But we also draw on technological immersion experience of using virtual reality, the 3D virtual reality infrastructure for peer learning and community building. And some of the outcomes, that is aspirational outcomes, I've taught it once and I'm going to teach it again, is developing and articulating the student's own relationship with the physical and natural environment, and conducting a socio-ecological history, so that we start understanding history from a socio-ecological framework. So when we look at a place, looking at both how the social systems and ecological systems co-evolve. And they also learn some technical skills, like in terms of 3D videos and exploring using the 3D video process to explore ecologies that are personally sacred and meaningful to them, and share with each other and learn some qualitative methodology skills as well. So I want to share a couple of quotes from the student journals from last time that I taught it. So one student talks about how I don't have access to my grandma and her sister's stories, but I'm interested in what has been passed down, and how, if at all, these stories and memories affect my parents' generation and my generation in terms of how we connect to the place we are in as descendants of immigrants and descendants of Holocaust survivors. And I have a lot of questions for my family members, but I think I will also dive into myself, like about my relationship to America as an idea, and also my relationship to my family's forced immigration, like we talked about earlier, the anger and the grief and the trauma, as well as my Jewish cultural identity and how that relates to my sense of place and belonging. And there's another quote from a second student, and I think the focus of indigenous knowledge and sacred ecologies and mindfulness and their connections emphasize the importance of connecting with and understanding nature and land on multiple deep levels. And it goes beyond just being mindful through being in nature, but in the deeper resonances of the land, its people, its histories. In a sense, the mindfulness exercises that we did, as well as the meditations, provided a foundation for us to ground ourselves physically within our bodies and connect to our breath and the world around us. Subsequently, our readings and socio-ecological studies and ethnography and qualitative research, indigenous knowledge and community building provided us with both frameworks and lines of thinking for us to pursue while practicing mindfulness or meditation. So in the interest of time, I'm kind of going to wrap this up with these two quotes from students, but we have a lot of journals from the students to quote, and also the students have also done interviews as part of their classwork with immigrants that we are going to have access to continue our qualitative analysis of secondary data collection. And so this is an example of how this particular framework can be deployed in the context of class. But we are also working on potentially developing this as a public kind of an engagement exercise to offer this as a tool for environmental initiatives to utilize and offer like a few weeks course or things like that for general public, and especially focused on immigrants. And so, thank you very much for listening to us, and please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to, discuss further, share more information, and opportunities for collaborations are always very welcome. So thank you, and over to Evan.
Yes, thank you all. I'm sorry we won't get a chance to meet in person this year, but just to echo Latha, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss our work with you, and thank you again for listening.